Namaste and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our continuing series, Evenings with Sraddhalu. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste, happy to be with all of you.
We are happy to continue our series on the same theme, the subtle physical worlds and secrets of occult sciences. First of all, we want to inform you all that we made a poll on YouTube. In case you want that we shall continue on these subjects, please vote, or please, maybe you might vote you would like to switch our subjects. Please feel free to use it until the end of our session. And as well, if you have any questions relating with our current topic, subtle physical worlds. I will start with a question that we received from Trinetra, and we will see the following. In the evening talk, part 40, on astrology, you mentioned the priest of Achyutananda, Malika Nadi. When he went into the library under the pond, was it a subtle physical world? The fast he had to observe, was it designed to purge and rid his body of kapha, earth, water, and make it more vata, air, akasha, so that he will be light enough to penetrate into the subtle physical? It's a good question, and we are looking forward to hear on subtle physical worlds.
Yes, it's a very interesting question. In fact, Trinetra has sent about, I think, 40 questions. They're all extremely interesting in themselves, and we could have continued the rest of the year just with those questions. But I've tried to cluster them theme-wise and then merge them with other questions which have been pending for a while also. But this current 3 questions will be immediately regarding this common theme of the subtle physical, and we are just at the right time of our discussion. So you will recall that in our session part 40, I had shared a fascinating experience I had in Odisha with the astrology, one of those nadis where you get the question as well as the answer appearing on text, etched in metal in that case. And there was an unusual experience of the man who got that metal nadi as well as palm leaf nadi from a well that he was guided to go through a dream, and he was pushed into the water. He found himself in some kind of a passage and in a room. He picked up this bundle and found himself thrown out of the water holding it. So that was his story. I'm assuming that it's not a made up story, that it's a genuine story. And I actually went to see where that well was, and I found somebody in that ashram who confirmed having seen him actually entering the water. So Trinetra's question is regarding that. Those of you who have not seen that session, do please take a look at part number 40 to refresh this information. So the question really is, when he was pushed into water and then found himself entering a passage and then a room, coming back with a bundle, was that a physical reality? Obviously it was not, because anyone going into the water does not find a tunnel there. And so was it a subtle physical world? That's Trinetra's question. And why did he have to go through the fast? And Trinetra gives a very interesting explanation that the body itself is subtilized by the fasting to reduce its denser layers and increase the subtler gradations in order to be able to enter the subtle physical. Yes, perhaps something like that would happen. As we will see following in the more detailed discussion in the next question, that the physical body itself going through the fasting would have been pushed to a brink where the subtle body and the physical body become a little loosely connected. This is generally what happens during extreme fasting. People feel at that point, after fasting of several days, a lot of vitality, great lightness, great strength, etc. And they feel like continuing the fast unendingly. except after a while the body begins to waste away and their psychology begins to get unbalanced. But it happens so slowly that they don't realize, until they may completely lose touch with the physical world and not even realize it. Because the subtle body is as if being made to separate, and the subtle body now absorbs life energy directly from the vital world. So you have this lightness, you have the increased um, energy, and so on. But the separation continues until you lose grip on the physical reality. And in the subtle world, it's not just an objectivized subtle world, but also that there is a subjective element where your own imaginations begin to fill in and become a reality. And therefore, it is extremely dangerous to push that kind of an exercise. But the idea behind that, the rationale, is the separation of the subtle body from the physical. You will find even many spiritual retreats, they will deny you food or reduce food intake to force this. And then you feel light, you feel wonderful, but spiritually it changes nothing. It only amplifies life energy, and that's about it. In a true spiritual retreat where you make a spiritual progress, food does not matter or should not matter much. So the idea was not so much penetrating the subtle physical with that, but separating the subtle body and making possible a projection in the subtle or subtle physical. Now, this is the part which gets interesting. So I don't have a direct experience of this. I have to go by the knowledge which we have of these things. And so a rational extension from that knowledge is that when his physical body was pushed into the water, it's not that he physically entered into the subtle domain. It would be a projection of his subtle body on a subtle physical level that was made to go into that domain, where he picked up this bundle. And then when he came back, on a physical level, his physical body would have been underwater, and then the bundle in his hand, rejoining with the physical body, there must have been some kind of a materialization of that vibration of the bundle, with which he is then thrown out. Which is why you will recall in that interview, I found he remembered going through a tunnel to the hall, but when he picked up the bundle, he found himself thrown out immediately from the water. So the suggestion here is that the physical body was right there. It was a subtle physical projection into a realm with which from where he came back with this. And so the next part of the question is, was it originally from the subtle physical or the gross physical, the bundle itself? So here we find the knowledge that the mother gives us to be very important. She has spoken extensively of materializations, etc., from this perspective. And there's a very important observation she makes, that a complete materialization of something which is only subtle, to a degree that it becomes a reality of the physical world permanently, has so far not been possible. And she explains why. And I want to read from this because it will, in a great part, answer this question, but also help us to better understand the further questions. So I will read from Mother's observation here. This is from the agenda, January 12th, 1962. And I will read from a little before because there's always something so fascinating in the context. Satprem asks, since the physical transformation is so difficult, one is tempted to wonder whether you could materialize something to work occultly and create a new body by occult means. So Mother says, that was the idea. For a few beings to first attain, here in this physical world, a level of realization giving them the power to materialize a supramental being. So this was considered. And then she says as an aside, I once told you, I put a body on a vital being, but I could not have made that body material. Now, this is a reference to something Mother mentions elsewhere, that at some point there was a certain asura or being, I don't know if you can call it asura. So I think she refers to that as the being which is known as Lucifer. And she says that she helped him to gain a subtle physical body form at one point. And I don't remember exactly the details of the context, and she has not really given too much of why she did that. But I think it is in reference to this. She says, Well, assuming it's that, but even if it's not, she gave a being, a vital being, a body. Now, a body means, obviously, she's referring to semi-physical or the domain of the subtle physical. But I couldn't have made that body material. It would have been impossible. Something is lacking. Something is lacking. Even if it were made visible, it would probably not be possible to make it permanent. So you can have a partial materialization where you have visibility, but not the full density of matter, but would not probably be made permanent. At the slightest opportunity, it would dematerialize. What we can't get is that permanence. It's something Sri Aurobindo and I have discussed. Discussed is one way of putting it. So obviously a lot of this communication was also on a level which is non-verbal, so telepathic or in consciousness terms. Sometimes we spoke about it, and his view was the same as mine. There is a power, yes, to fix the form here on earth, a power we don't have. Even people with the ability to materialize things, like Madame Théon, for instance, can't make their materializations last. It can't be done. They don't last. They don't have the quality of physical things. And without this quality, well, the creation's continuity could not be assured. Yes, that's an interesting point. One might indeed wonder about it. Now, what she means by this continuity, in a material object which is entirely material, of course, there is substance which is material. That can be replicated by materializations. But here, there is a gradation behind which is complete. In a materialized object, there would be something missing. Some gradation, some degree, which would make it somehow less physical or differently physical. So then Mother continues, I knew the whole occult process in detail, but I would never have been able to make that being more material, even if I had tried. Visible, yes, but not permanent and progressive. So when you become totally material, you become a part of the evolution of matter. That part would be missing. And mind you, this is my personal case. I don't think I've wasted any time. Because you might say that I had known because you might say that what had I known 40 years ago what I know now at the age of 40 instead of 80, well, there would have been the sense of a lot more time to work with, and so on. We skip that. But this idea that a permanent materialization so far has not been done. And the same principle goes the other way. A physical object dematerialized eventually will tend to return into a physical density. So one can hold it off, or one can materialize temporarily. Eventually, though, it will fade out. I recall once somebody from Auroville had gone to Kerala, met somebody who used to materialize things, and then he brought it to show me. See, that man gave it to me. Feeling it, the feel of it was such, I said, this is not a materialized object. It is a physical object which was teleported, which is generally what many of these yogis or magicians do. Even the famous ones who used to materialize objects, they would or watches, for example, they would have them stored in their room, and then it would be transferred into their hand and materialized. So it's called an apport. You bring it from there, you dematerialize there and materialize here. So essentially it was a physical object, in which case, of course, it remains permanently. So to Trinathra's question, that bundle itself, was it physical originally? I would expect so. If it was put in a semi-materialized state in a subtle physical domain and then brought back from there, that's possible. So then his question is, can we store gross items indefinitely? I would expect not. Or if you had to store indefinitely, there would have to be some energy, some mechanism to keep the pressure for it not to relapse. What is interesting is wherever we have seen or heard of such entries into subtle physical domains, inevitably it is inside the earth or inside a mountain. You don't have an opening where you enter a subtle physical domain which is open. So that seems to be for me an indicator that perhaps the density of the mountain or the earth is used as a means to support, to prevent it from full emergence into the physical. So if your subtle physical is put in the same space as rock, then perhaps there's a pressure for it to not snap back. You bring it out and then it snaps back. This is speculation, but it seems to me something reasonable, perhaps. I think that is as far as this question goes. Beyond this, I would be speculating. So I'll leave it at that. We'll go on with the next two questions, which also deal with this.
Another question from Tinetra on this subject. How does one enter the subtle physical or even the vital world with a physical body? Are there any accounts of that? Will there be a big difference in time if we entered the subtle physical world? Does time move faster here or in the subtle physical world? How does ether fit into these interdimensional travel concepts? In parentheses, Dr. Stephen Greer, in the video above top secret, mentions how the US has discovered these kinds of technologies and labeled them as weird science and freaking magic.
Yes. Again, the question is quite fascinating and opens many dimensions. I have to say that my experience of these things is somewhat limited, and even from what I have read and heard, or heard from people who have seen and so on, the questions really push it into a borderline of experiences which are not so common. Nevertheless, we have enough descriptive knowledge and theoretical understanding to give some indication of answers to these questions. So, if you had to enter the subtle physical world or vital world, it would not be with the physical body. It would necessarily be with the part of you that belongs to that world, obviously. If you had to, for example, enter the subtle physical, even using the physical body, you would have to dematerialize it to the grade that you want to enter. So it could be two ways. One is you partially dematerialize and enter that world, or you leave behind the physical and have a part of your subtle physical that extends, projects out, and explores, enters that world, and then comes back. But you were not conscious that you had actually separated from the gross physical, which also could happen. So, as in answer to some of these, I will share with you some examples. But before entering those examples, there is one place where Sri Aurobindo gives you as if the key, the secret of the entire subtle physical domain. So as you know, Sri Aurobindo has written extensively about so many things, so much knowledge. It is, as Mother said, in principle, if you go deep enough, you will find all the knowledge, everything you need to know. And because he goes to root principles and essential principles, which are universal, you literally can find the key to anything. But there's one place where he gives it in a way which is more symbolic, mantric, and therefore as if key points, key indicators, like the finger pointing to an ocean, like a sutra almost. And so that is in Savitri, as you're aware. And there is a whole canto which describes the subtle physical world. It is called the Kingdom of Subtle Matter, obviously. And he describes the whole rationale of how it appears, what role it has in relation to the physical world and other worlds, and particularly the domain itself and the gradations within that domain in a general way, of course. So there's this very interesting line, and I will read from it. He's describing how from the highest regions of consciousness, the sense of form develops and becomes the basis for form on all the planes. Then he says, this is page 106, for long before Earth's solid vest was forged by the technique of the atomic void, a lucent envelope of self-disguise was woven around the secret spirit in things. So this is the beginning of the sense of form, from essential spirit, which is necessarily free of form. And then from there it develops and develops. And the last stage of the most material, Earth's solid vest, he calls. It's as if the soul is putting on layers and layers. And the last vest is Earth's solid vest, which is the densest layer. And that is created by the technique of the atomic void. I had written about this some 20 years ago in one of the articles in Service Letter, but it is a whole technology which is suggested by just this phrase of how form is created in the sense of solidity and permanence out of something which is essentially formless and not solid and not permanent. By the whirling of energy and the whirlings of whirlings and combinations, which creates almost like a foam of matter. But if you cut through, you'll always end up with other matter. But the matter itself that you're cutting is made by the technique of the atomic void of energy whirling, encapsulating the void inside the whirl, and then appearing as if a container and combinations of these containers. These are what we would call particles or atomic structures, molecular structures, and so on. But finally, they are hiding a void. And science itself recognizes this. Depending on how you calculate, they will say 99.999999% of all matter is empty space, just whirling energy. So he is pointing to this, and then he describes the characteristics of the subtle physical world. And I just read a few lines which are for the purpose of our discussion. He says, "It is the subtle ground of matter's worlds." That is, all material worlds are formed out of this substance. But it is the ground, the foundation on which the external denser matter is held. And then, in the folds of its creative memory, it guards the deathless type of perishing things. So the thing which is made from it perishes, but the template which it holds, that is immortal. Very important to recognize this. And then he says, its sense fathers our body's reflexes. That is, the subtle physical contained in your physical body as a backdrop, as a support, as an infused immanent, actually is the basis for the body's reflexes, which is intelligence in the body itself. So sometimes you touch something very hot, your body shrinks even before you're conscious of the pain of the heat. The knowledge of how to deal with it and the nature of the danger itself is all responded to by the subtle physical content there. Even to the degree that the body senses before an external event comes close enough. You're walking on the road, a car passes by. Mother describes how the subtle physical sensed it and pushed back before even she was conscious of the tram which was passing by, and so on. So the reflexes in the body are actually rooted in there. That's where the animals sense impending volcanoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, and are made to run away. Its fine suggestions are a covert fount for our iridescent rich imaginings, and so on. That is, it's suggesting on many levels, many things which we then imagine. Because already in that plane of the subtle physical, perfect forms are held. All the forms there are naturally beautiful. The higher ranges are more beautiful, the lower ranges could be terrifying, but perfect in form still. And this is a characteristic which gives you a hint, a clue, that it is the subtle physical. So I now come back to the question itself, and Sri Aurobindo explains this. Physical world, as any other world, itself has further finer gradations. So the subtle physical, in the Veda they speak of 7 planes within the physical, and then within each of those you could have finer gradations. So any of these could be the domain of one's experience. And so, having understood that, recognize that experiences of the subtle physical also could be of various kinds. So his question next is, will there be a big difference of time if we entered the subtle physical world? I'll share a few examples for this. This is somebody I met in the US. He was having experiences he had no idea what they were. And he said, one day I was sleeping, then suddenly I find myself projected on an island. It was the physical body. He's certain I could touch things physically. Rock was rock, ocean was ocean, it was hot. My body was physical. I'm very convinced about that, he said. And I lived there for almost a week. And then I came back, just like that. And I don't know how I got there, how I came back. And I don't know what to make of it. So he was quite confused. And I asked him, when you came back, were you back at the same point on the same day that you left? He said, yes. I said, that's because you were projected in the subtle physical body. So the sense of maybe he had slept for an hour or so, but the subtle physical had projected and spent a week there and come back. And he had the sense that he had been out for a week because it was so tangible as an experience. So this is just as an example that yes, it does have a completely different sense of time. And that depending on your consciousness, you can actually speed it up or slow it down. Unlike the gross physical, where there is a certain objectivity even in your sense of time, on that level, things can be already slightly more subjective. So another example would be almost every tradition in the world has stories of how someone entered a cave, came back, and he thought a day had passed. He comes back and here 20 years have passed. You've heard of stories like that in fairy tales. But these stories are so persistent and common across traditions. Sometimes they will tell you, oh, it was in that cave that it happened. And there's a truth to it. That's because you entered the subtle physical domain and the time sense there was very different. There is another example I want to share. This is from a writer who has an extraordinary narration of outer body experiences, a Frenchman called Marc Aubin that I've mentioned before. Unfortunately, his book is only in French, but otherwise I would have recommended for everyone to read it. He describes how once he was out of his body, and it was obviously a level close to the subtle physical. He was seeing his body on the bed, and his girlfriend came into the room. Now he knew that if she wakes him up, he will lose his chance to explore the subtle physical, and he was trying to stop her. Hey, don't go, don't touch my body, don't wake me. Of course, she can't hear him. He's shouting, doing everything he can. And then he describes something happened where the intensity of his focus to stop her made that his sense of time slowed down, and she began to move as if in slow motion. And it took almost 1 minute for her to make one single step in that state, during which time he was fully conscious. His sense of time was completely normal. But in relation to her, it was slowed down, or rather, depending on how you see it, speeded up. That is, he had 1 full minute while she would have experienced a second only. But it was that state of distress, of the intensity of focus of concentration that made that shift. And then he realized, oh, I can do it consciously. I can speed it up or slow it down. It's fascinating to think about it. So yes, it could happen that entering the subtle physical, you come back and you had a physical experience lasting many days, and you come back and it's just as if no time has passed, or maybe an hour or so. Or the reverse, that you've spent a day there, you come out and maybe a year has passed. Both are possible because time is relatively more flexible. And as you go up the planes of consciousness, time and space become more and more fluid, more flexible and relative. We'll come to another example of the space distortion later when we read something from the mother. So, does time move faster? Faster, slower, depends on your choice. You can change it. And then, how does ether fit into these interdimensional travel concepts? That is a bit more complex, and we would get into a kind of a technological issue there. So just before that, I want to share a few more examples about this, then I will come to the ether aspect. There is another example. In fact, there are a lot of examples of people going into subtle physical experiences thinking it's physical, when in fact it was subtle physical. One classic one is of Paul Brunton. If you have ever heard of a book called A Search in Secret Egypt, this is an extraordinary man. He traveled also in India, wrote a book called A Search in Secret India. For some reason, perhaps a higher guidance, soul's call, In each of these spaces that he traveled, he met extraordinary people, had the, let's say, sole guidance to discover extraordinary spaces also. So when he came to India, there's a whole chapter he describes going to Ramana Maharshi's ashram and his experience with Ramana Maharshi, which was one of the reasons, one of the ways that Ramana Maharshi became famous in the West. But just before he goes to Ramana Maharshi, he has entered South India. There are 2 pages of a description where he says, I went to a place which was like a heaven on earth. It was such an extraordinarily beautiful atmosphere. And he describes being there for a few days, but the people there, the spiritual heads, did not give him permission to write about it. He was explicitly told not to speak of where it is, for obvious reasons, because as you will realize, he had come to the Sri Aurobindo ashram and had darshan of the mother. I don't think he met Sri Aurobindo directly, but I don't know if it was during a darshan time. But he was asked not to publicize. And because I think this was in the 30s, they needed to keep it private. Otherwise, there would be too many, casual visitors, which would spoil the concentration. But those 2 pages are also worth reading. So he goes to the Great Pyramid of Egypt. Somehow in those days, it was easier. He sneaks in at night. There was no protection, no guard, no tourism department to stop you. And he goes into the king's chamber, lies down in the sarcophagus, which, as you know, is just an empty box. It was never meant for a sarcophagus. It was an initiation room. And perhaps from past memory, he lies down inside it. And it's so dark. He says, it was so dark, literally you could imagine things and you would see it. But then at night, suddenly he sees a light. So he's not sure if it's his imagination. And then an old man comes carrying a lantern. So first he thinks it's someone who has come from outside. And then he figures out he's dressed differently. And this man, I think they had a conversation. He tells him that he will show him something. But the condition is, he should not look behind. He will take him into a passage, but he should not look behind. And so he was then taken, he comes out, he enters as if an opening, walks, and the old man is leading him a passage which is totally unknown to him, but it's inside the pyramid. He's taking him to some secret chamber. And at some point, he's overwhelmed by his curiosity. He can't help himself. I have to register how I got in so that I can come back. And he turns around and he sees only a blank wall. He had gone through a wall, literally. And because he broke that rule, the experience stopped. He found himself back. That old man, obviously a priest who was a guardian spirit there, left, and that was it. Now, when he describes it, one has the feeling as if it's a physical experience. In fact, it was subtle physical. Yes, there are physical chambers in the Great Pyramid where things are kept physically. But the entry that he was given was in the subtle physical body, through which he could experience physical things and yet pass through the barrier of the wall through which he went. So this is another example of this. There are many traditions also, particularly in the last 100 years, who speak of their founders or guides being in the Himalayas. They call them Mahatmas, they call them Babaji, who materialize or send materialized objects, etc. They are all living in subtle physical body, not in gross physical body. So they materialize, but they can't stay. They bounce back into their subtle physical domain. There are also in the Indian tradition many beings who are considered immortal. One such being Ashwatthama in the Mahabharata times, who he has still his suffering from the bead that was torn off from his head, and is said to be immortal. There are people who have actually met him, and I'm referring to people who can be trusted for their narration. And he appears, but it's a subtle physical being, immortal there, materializing as and when needed. So all this is to say that the experiences themselves do exist. You can go into those domains. People from there can come here. And there's one fascinating example from a Swiss teacher I have referred to before, who spoke of how he was led into the world of the ants. So he's in the forest sitting there and the ants invite him. And he finds his body shrinking as he enters the ant hill and goes inside and mixes with the ants. They show things around and then he comes out. But it's described by him as if it's a physical experience when in fact it's in the subtle physical body. So again, question is whether the physical body partially dematerialized or it was left lying down under a tree and the subtle physical only went in. So all this is to say that these experiences can be so vivid and, well, are so real. The technology itself of how one would be able to do something like that, is it possible to do it technologically? This question needs to be dealt with a couple of more examples. Some of you have heard of Billy Meyer. He is a Swiss who has seen a lot of flying saucers, photographed them, all this from the 1970s. When camera was a very complex device, you took a photo, it took a day to clean, print, and so on. You could not make superimpositions, you had no digital processing technology of any kind, and here's the most clear, crisp film with actual plastic film and photos of that period. Sometimes flying saucers so close to be almost materially tangible, sometimes flying above with airplanes, the Swiss Air Force chasing them, and so on. These are exceptional. The man is absolutely genuine. What is interesting is there's a description of one of the US major from the US Air Force who had gone to investigate his work. He was in his house when Billy Meyer received a call to go and meet the people from the flying saucers, extraterrestrials. So he steps out of the house. It's heavy rain at that point. There's a downpour happening. He steps out of the house without an umbrella, maybe wearing a raincoat, but steps out of the house. As he stepped out, this man from the United States, he comes into the room and is told by the family members of Billy Meyer, oh, he just got a call, he's left. So this man rushes out, Stevens, I think his name was. He rushes out, goes to the door, opens the door, it's too late. Billy Meyer has vanished. And he sees there on the mud in front of the house, the steps of Billy Meyer's footprints in the rain, in the mud, footprints. They take 3 or 4 steps and then they stop. They vanish. Literally, totally, no more footprints in complete mud. An hour later, there's a phone call from Billy Meyer saying, I'm at such and such a location, please come and pick me up. So this Stevens goes there, Wendell Stevens, his name. He goes with the family, they go and pick him up. He's standing next to a little hut with an overhang, so he's completely dry. Not one drop of water. From the house to that place is a long distance in complete open rain. So it's literally as if he stepped out of the house. As he is walking, he was made to dematerialize or move into a subtle physical grade. He had his meeting for 1 hour, and then they drop him back and he's there physically in that overhang, completely dry. Now this is to tell you that many such experiences, which apparently seem to be purely physical, would often have a subtle physical character where the body was partly shifted to the subtle physical grade, and so now he is no more wet from the rain and taken wherever it is, easily moved around, and so on. I share this because he also records how in his contact with the extraterrestrials, there is one group of extraterrestrials he refers to, who he is introduced to, and they claim to come from a different universe, which is slightly offset from ours, and they call it the Dahl universe. Whatever that vocabulary is, I don't know. And they have to do something to shift from their universe into ours, and then do something technologically to shift back. He meets them, interacts with them, they shift back, they vanish, and so on. And they're using machines to do this transfer. And this is to answer the question that there is obviously a method to do this technologically, to dematerialize into the subtle physical or to rematerialize from the subtle physical to the gross physical. It can be done by occult means, and whatever can be done by occult means, at least on the physical domain, can be also done by physical means technologically. The exact means is not known to us so far. Perhaps there are secret programs where such experiments are done, but unless you have a solid theoretical foundation for it, one would find difficult to really develop the technology. And so to Trinetra's question about does it have something to do with ether, interdimensional travel concepts? Yes, definitely. So the interdimension is really the subtle physical domain. And yes, the entire physical world would be, including the subtle physical and the 7 gradations there, would be formed of the physical ether. And you could think of it as different frequencies of vibration within the same etheric substance. So I'll give an analogy here. Right now, within us, so many frequencies of radio waves are passing through. They don't collide with each other, they don't collide with us. But if you took a coil and a capacitor and resonate, make it pulse at the same frequency as the radio waves, you are rippling in the ether at the frequency of the ripples of the radio waves, and therefore these will bang into each other. So to the radio waves which were passing, saying, oh, there's nothing here, the resonance of this appears as if a substance thence forming into its grade and creating a bump. You change the frequency and the bump has passed and the radio wave passes through, or frequency has got higher up and this radio wave passes through. So literally tuning the frequency of the resonance of the coil and capacitor is creating a resistance on different frequencies, as if materializing on different frequencies a form. Once you think in these terms, the whole principle becomes accessible. Can you now do that without coil and the capacitor? Or an equivalent process now, taking any piece of matter and changing its current atomic resonance frequencies, raising them, would effectively dematerialize from the gross physical to a subtler grade of subtle physical, or vice versa. And yes, such things would be possible then. If it can be done, or once it can be done, you can create devices, machines in which you could dematerialize, travel at great distances, and then rematerialize, which would be one of the ways by which one can travel across galaxies to great distances within the physical universe by popping out into the subtle physical and then popping into the gross physical at the other location. The actual transfer would be very quick in between, almost instantaneous, even though the distance might be massive. The shift would be disorienting necessarily, and one does find descriptions of such moves in Billy Byers' descriptions of trips that he was given in flying saucers. Now, all this sets up a background, and we will now read what Mother had to say about this very interesting thing regarding other planets, physical planets. Okay, so we go to Mother is speaking of the changes happening currently because of the pressure of the new consciousness and the disruption it is creating. And she says, according to what people tell me who listen to the radio or read the newspapers, none of which I do, the whole world is undergoing an action, which for the moment is unsettling. It seems the number of apparently mad people is increasing considerably. In America, for instance, all the youth seem to be seized by a kind of curious giddiness, which for reasonable people would be disquieting, but which is a sure indication that an uncommon force is at work. This is in 1964, she's saying. It is the disruption of all habits and all rules. It's good. For the moment, it's a bit strange, but it's necessary. The action isn't limited, she says. That is, it's probably limited to the Earth, although manifestations from other planets or other worlds seem to be multiplying too. And there have been experiences lately, rather curious ones. So Satprem asks, other physical planets? Mother says, physical, yes, physical. I don't know if you have heard this. It's something P told me. She was still in Switzerland, and shortly before she came back here, she had a vision while meditating, and she saw 5 big luminous cigars going past like this slowly, one behind the other in single file. When she woke up, she wondered what it was. And a few days later, she read in a newspaper the account of people in southern France who saw above the sea 5 luminous cigars go by in single file, exactly the same color as those she had seen. But in their case, they saw it with their physical eyes. So that seems interesting, Mother says. It was clearly a phenomenon of a subtle physical order in its origin, or material vital in its origin, but which manifested physically, and which may very well have come from other planets that are a little more subtle than the Earth. Very interesting suggestion, very interesting description. And then she says there are many other experiences. This one I remember clearly. The action is widespread. So, this phrase she uses, other planets that are a little more subtle than the Earth, very suggestive. Now, it could be that she's referring to an entire planet that is of a subtle physical. So, physically, you would see nothing. Or she could speak of a physical planet in which the civilization and its realities are on a subtle physical level. And so you could go to the planet and say, this is barren desert, but there'd be beings living there in the subtle physical of that density. Interesting. And then they would have a technology. They would come into what today we call cigar-shaped spacecraft. They come to the Earth, materialize. So originally, as she says, subtle physical, and then materializing, doing their thing, and then accelerating at great speed or suddenly vanishing, dematerializing into the subtle physical, and so on. There's a very interesting example I recall reading from, this was again one of the United States pilots, one of the senior most in the Air Force, who was in, I think it was in Vietnam. My memory is a bit clouded there, but I think it was in Vietnam. They were on a sortie and they saw a gigantic flying saucer, and he describes the whole thing in great detail. It was big disc shaped, and then there was a tower in the center. Some of it was transparent. They could see beings inside, and it's hanging in midair. Their craft comes and they start circling around it. And then something strange happened. After a while, it's as if on the other side from where they were, a doorway opens into the sky. So it was gray and somewhat cloudy, but through that doorway in the sky, bright sunlight streaming through, and they can see through it as if a completely different world. And this flying saucer now moves, enters that portal, crosses into it, and then as if that doorway passes or the portal closes, and that's it again, gray sky. And these planes were left here. Imagine if the planes had followed through physically, they would have entered into that domain or that world or that other part of the universe. I don't know what it would be, or the subtle physical itself. And this would be one of the reasons perhaps why sometimes we have these examples of planes or ships vanishing completely with no trace at all. That there was something else making a transition and they got sucked in the wake of that transition. So yes, such things do happen. Yes, such things can be done technologically, and Mother makes reference to it. It does not mean all flying saucers are subtle physical. They could be physical who dematerialize to transfer and then make physical again. But they could be also equally civilizations living in the subtle physical who materialize for purpose of their work. So this gives you an idea of what could potentially happen in our future for humanity as we develop such technologies also. Having said that, our discussion will not be complete unless we look at something else, which is more important from a spiritual point of view. That because there is a continuum, you can train yourself to actually shift levels consciously without breaking continuity. Because you have a physical body, you can do that. Okay? Because within you are the subtle physical gradations also. That's part of your evolution. And I had met in Cyprus one of these extraordinary persons. He was a mystic, he was a spiritual master, teacher. I don't use the word master casually. And I had occasion to spend a few days meeting, interacting with him, very interesting things. He shared this experience, one of his early experiences of awakening. He was sitting in his room, in his sofa, just like that, almost in a daydream for no reason. And suddenly his consciousness began to shift through the levels. So from the gross physical body, going up the gradations. And everything in the room around him, with eyes open, began to change. So he shifted up all the way into some subtle domain, gradation of consciousness, and then shifted back. And all around him, everything just changed and then gradually came back through all these levels. And it was like, oh, what just happened? He had other such initial experiences which were quite remarkable. At that time, he was, I think Cyprus was under invasion by Turkey. He was in an open space and one of these Turkish aircraft was coming with guns blazing. He ran, comes to a wall which is completely closed. It's a cloister, I think, monks living inside. He comes to the wall, he can go nowhere, and the plane is coming with guns firing. Suddenly he finds himself on the other side. And because of that, he was saved. Bullets didn't touch him. How he got to the other side, he had no idea. So there were experiences like that he had, which he shared, which were his early experiences. Obviously, there are things developed in past incarnations, and the inner being at that moment came forward in time of danger and just made this jump. So dematerialized and rematerialized, or made a jump literally from one side to the other of the wall to save. And the other experiences of awakening going through these levels. So this is to say that without technology, we should be able to develop full awareness of all these gradations. And at least I'm not speaking of projecting out. That may require a great skill or some danger involved. But becoming aware on these levels and being able to shift through these levels should be within our capacity. I will say is within our capacity if we give it the necessary time. And I will read one more from the mother's description of, again, it's a passing comment she makes as part of some other discussion. And we'll take a quick look at that. So she says she was sick at that time. She describes how she's fighting the sickness and removing it from the body. And then she says, I was fully conscious each time the attack came. I went like this and my arms were not affected at all. Then she says, when it was over, I consciously entered the most material, subtle physical, just beyond the body. So she's sitting there, the thing is done, and she makes a shift into that level. So the physical body is obviously there, but her consciousness shifts to that gradation, at which point she is aware of her subtle physical body and the densest level just close to the gross physical. And obviously, because she's in that grade, she's also seeing the room and the space around her with the senses of that grade, and therefore also seeing the reality of that grade. So I consciously entered the most material, subtle physical just beyond the body. I was sitting in my room there, an immense cubic room, reading or writing something. When I heard the door open and close, but I was busy and didn't pay attention. So in her subtle physical body, the room, the subtle physical world is immense and it is cubic. As you know, her physical room was not like that. And elsewhere, when she's talking with Satprem, she speaks of, the ashram, when you go into the subtle physical ashram, it's so much bigger, isn't it? So at that time, she hears this door open and close. I was busy and didn't pay attention, presuming it was one of the people usually around me. Then suddenly, I had an unpleasant sensation in my body. I raised my head and looked, and I saw someone there. Do you know how magicians in Europe dress in short satin breeches and a shirt? He was wearing something like that. He was Indian, tall and dark, and with slicked down hair, what you would normally call a handsome young man. He seemed to have been drawn there because he was standing in front of me, staring into space, not looking at me. And the moment I saw him, there was the same sensations in all my cells that I have with what I have been calling the disease she had that she was struggling with. And simultaneously, all the cells felt disgust, a tremendous will of rejection. So it was obviously the form through which that attack was coming on her. Then I sat up. I sat up straight. I didn't stand up. So, it's in the subtle physical. So, and said to him as forcefully as possible, "How do you dare to come in here?" I said it so loudly that the noise woke me up. I don't know what happened, but things went much better afterwards. So interesting that she consciously shifts into the subtle physical body. She is writing, she's doing work there in her subtle physical body. Probably the physical body at that point is in a state of semi-trance. But there she speaks so loudly that she wakes up and falls back into the gross physical. Interesting. And then she discusses what that person was. It was more like an instrument, a cover for the person who was actually attacking her through him. And so there's a different discussion. So this is again to give you an idea of how one can shift like this. And we should be able to do eventually. Of course, you have to give it time, as you would to develop a physical skill, because after all, it's of a physical skill of consciousness, isn't it? So there's a whole discussion we will come to perhaps at the end of our discussion, where the mother speaks of how we have to develop our consciousness in the physical body and the inner and outer and so on. We'll discuss that later. But I think this gives you a full picture. Most of the questions which are part of this portion have been answered. I'll just take a quick look at in the chat box also. Okay, we have too many questions. So there are questions regarding strength and fearlessness for the occult practice, or are there safer occult practices? Effect of food, somebody has commented. Clara asks, what can you tell us about light nutrition, the phenomenon where people can nourish the physical body directly and exclusively from etheric fields or prana? Well, there are people, as you have heard, who claim to eat nothing, and they look at the sun and absorb the sunlight or energy from the sun, or they absorb life force directly. They just drink water and that's enough. Yes, probably they can do that, because it is possible to draw life energy. The gross physical does not need food for life energy. It needs food to replace physical substance. So some of these practices these people do is they gradually reduce the quantity of food until it is less and less. And at some point the body begins to adapt, comes to an edge which is very close, where it needs just a little bit to replace what it doesn't have. Not everyone can do it. Not everyone should try. It is extremely dangerous and it serves no purpose spiritually. And then they can get it to that point where they just drink some juices through which the nutritional content is taken, or through the water. And then it's as if something on some other level is absorbing and materializing by the occult means. So there are methods also which are somewhat occult, where monks used to do that when they would be in a closed space, in a cave where there is not enough food. Perhaps the cave entrance is blocked with snow. Where do you get food? So there's an occult technique by which you are as if absorbing material, and physical material even. But the method itself is indirect, in the sense that you create as if a pipe of a subtle physical substance which reaches out to that thing where you need the food and draws. Internally, it is absorbed physically on some level. But finally, it is equivalent of eating. And after all that, nothing changes in your consciousness. At best, you have learned some unusual skill, and that's about it. But it does not change the physical consciousness. It does not change the spiritual consciousness. So yes, it's possible, and I would classify it as an occult experience or an occult attainment, very much like a siddhi. But again, spiritually, of no value. come to the next question. Slowing down time. The problem with inducing trance to slow down time is that the body becomes numb and stiff. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. The sense of time slowing down or speeding up is purely in the subtle physical body. Your physical body might be asleep in a normal way, and to anybody else checking it, it'll be just be you sleeping, and you're in dream world for them at least. So Clara asks, is the supramental body built of subtle physical matter, or is it the true matter referred to by Sri Aurobindo, or something else altogether? The point of physical transformation is that it has to be physical matter, gross physical matter that has to be divinized. There are many traditions, including certain Buddhist traditions which speak of rainbow body and such, where after leaving the physical body, they transfer themselves into a subtle body. Now, which one it is, it's not clear, depending on the traditions or depending on the individuals even. It could be one of the subtle physical worlds, it could be one of the vital physical worlds, but it is a world where you can maintain your body young always and of a certain density, which is not gross physical. And then you materialize as and when you need, if at all you decide to. Otherwise, you're always young, and that's your youth of eternity. But you have only quit the gross physical. This world remains unchanged. So it has absolutely no value. It is equivalent to people who would say, now I have freed myself from my karmic bonds. I am a soul that is free. I don't need to reincarnate. Great. But what has changed? Nothing. Even for you, fundamentally, nothing has changed. Your soul was always free. Your self is always self. Come what may, isn't it? Only you've transferred your consciousness to its freedom and then chosen to cut off from the physical world. What was the point then of coming in? Because you chose to come in, remember? So the point is, this density of matter, this tissue, has to progressively become more conscious until it becomes super conscious. Its capacities, its qualities will then undergo a change, just as your tissue is fundamentally different from what we would call metal or rock, although it is made of the same molecules, isn't it? All our nutrition that we take through the food, when you say you lack some minerals, well, that's taken in by taking in rock. Salts are rock. But then they are modified and changed until they become living, conscious substance. This will further change into superconscious, divinely conscious substance, where the body will be able to feel the self, relate to the self, and act by the will of the self and the powers of the self, beginning to reveal more and more through the physical body. That is what is worthwhile as a physical transformation, fundamentally changing things in the physical world, at least in that substance. But one substance changing would have a ripple effect on the universe itself. So the supramental body will be of a physical origin and of a physical density, but representing substance which has become divinely conscious. That's the evolution in the body itself. Obviously, you can't do that unless your own consciousness has reached that grade of awareness. So when you're mentally aware, you can infuse the mental awareness into the body. When you're supramentally aware, you will be able to infuse supramental awareness into the body. Intermediate is you're becoming aware in the intuitive consciousness and infusing intuition into the physical body. And then the physical body knows, the body knows and can do things which do not need your mind to intervene. It can do directly because it knows directly what it knows and how to do at a level bypassing your intelligence, your mental intelligence. And there was one person in the ashram that we know of who had actually worked in his body in this way. Kapali Shastriyar, my teacher's teacher, had this intuitivization of the physical consciousness. And I've shared this experience many times. Working in one of the paints section of the construction department of the ashram, they had to mix paints to get a specific color. And that has to be so precise. You mix a little bit here and there, and the new color does not match the old. But in his case, the physical consciousness being intuitivized, he would scoop out and it would be the exact quantity of paint and it would get poured. He would prepare food and it would be the exact quantity needed for all those who were coming, and it would end to the last drop. Nothing in excess, nothing in less, meeting exactly the requirement. And so that kind of precision spontaneously happening in the physical actions would be one of the characteristics of intuitivization of the body. But this must then go all the way to the supramentalization. So, yes, somebody mentions Arunachala mountain. That is where Ramana Maharshi was living, as you would know. He speaks of how, as he would walk on the mountain, he said he could look into the mountain and see a whole city inside it. And he says there were streets, people walking, and there were street lights. And this is one of those examples of a subtle physical domain. It had materiality, it was inside the mountain, but it had materiality of that grade. So, yes, in principle, people who live in that could come out, or one could be made capable of visiting it, and so on. But there are many such regions. I believe in almost all sacred spaces, there is as if a kind of a subtle physical world or pocket of beings, people living in those domains. And because they are of a subtle physical grade, they don't age. So they could often be there for centuries and still retain things. So that is one of the ways by which in the past they attempted to preserve knowledge for the future by storing it in such kinds of spaces. So Kiara asks, what is the difference between supramentalized body and ascended body, such as Babaji and other immortal masters? So that's the difference I spoke of earlier. See, this word ascended master, ascended body is a modern newfangled vocabulary which is undefined. You see, everyone uses it in the way that serves them. I've often come across also this word enlightened beings. What does it mean, enlightened? Oh, it's an undefined term. So if you go into European history, it was the age of enlightenment when all of Europe was enlightened, remember? Because they broke away from a very oppressive religion and then got into reasoning thought and attempted to organize life by reason, and that's called enlightenment. So enlighten is any kind of light. It could be mental light, it could be vital light, it could be, well, physical light also. So when they say someone is an enlightened master, it tells you nothing. And unfortunately, they have mixed this term with the Buddhist tradition. So in the Buddhist tradition, they speak of nirvana, which is a very defined term. And even in various traditions, there are gradations or degrees of nirvana. In translating to English, they replace the word nirvana by enlightenment, which is okay as long as you stay with the definition. But because the English word enlightenment is a loose term, it gets misused now and mixed with all kinds of things. So when someone claims to be enlightened master, you really don't know what it means. Similarly, ascended. What do you mean ascended? Sometimes they say, oh, the person left the physical body and lives in subtle bodies. Sometimes they mean by that he has grown in consciousness and is no more required to reincarnate. But in all these cases, coming to the question, they live in a subtle body, has no correlation with the physical body and its transformation. Equally, in the Tibetan tradition, the rainbow body, they describe like this: the master has prepared his capacity as at the time of death, he separates from his physical body, forms his rainbow body, and then uses the full tapas of his energy to dematerialize his physical, and it is reduced to either ashes or flowers or just vanishes. So to the humans, the physical body vanished and now the master is in a rainbow body. But it's not that the physical got transformed, it just got dematerialized. And generally it leaves behind some powder, some ash, which you hear in many other traditions also. If you go to Ramana Maharshi's ashram, just beyond there's a cave where he stayed for a while. It's called Virupaksha cave, where there's a mound of ash, which is supposed to be the material from one of the saints who dematerialized his body and left behind an ash pile. And they say it is permanent, you can take from it and it always remains full. But the physical substance was left behind. You went into a subtle grade. It has no correlation to the physical transformation that Sri Aurobindo speaks of, where this transformed body will be of this density, will be able to engage with the physical world, will belong to the physical world, and embody, incarnate the divine consciousness through the body into the physical substance itself. So Rupal asks, Parshuram and Hanuman as living beings? Yes, but they are not physical. Which level they live on, I don't know, I cannot say. Maybe they are more at the level of the subtle, vital, mental, etc. Or more likely the essential prototype is of an overmental being, of which there are sometimes projections or emanations on mental or vital levels. And that's why you don't meet them on a physical level at all. Yeah, so Bullish asks, Bullish Harvey, can you travel to the sun in the non-physical? Yes, you can go to other planets. Depending on how you project yourself, you could project in the mental consciousness, you would sense the mental domain. But the skill is to be able to project at a level which is close enough to the physical that you can sense the physical domain. So this reminds me of another great example. One of these great, let's say, occultists who had the gift of out-of-body projection, exteriorization, is Ingo Swann, that I've referred to many times. He describes how he was asked by the US military at some point to monitor certain locations on the moon because they had detected active machine-based activity of the moon, including mining operations by certain beings. This was in the early 70s. And they had been as if warded off, prevented from observing closely. So they come to Ingo Swann to spy on that operation. He projects himself, and the first thing he says on going, he says, looks like I'm in the wrong place because I can breathe air. He comes back and tells them, I think I went into the wrong place. They said, no, you were on the right place. Go back. So this is one of the great secrets that he reveals, that in fact on the moon there is an atmosphere. It's very thin, very similar to as what you have when you go high up on Earth's mountains, let's say at the top of the Himalayas, but it is breathable. So he's able to project himself at a level dense enough that he can breathe or sense the air. He's describing the machinery, the lights, the mining operation, and then he sees the human beings sitting there. So he's curious and he's talking. His physical body is here on Earth. He's talking what he says, what he sees. And as he approaches one of these human forms, the fellow is at a table with some paper and some drawings. He senses the presence of Ingo Swann and turns there and excitedly starts pointing and calls other human beings, human forms to come. That's when Ingo Swann feels he's been detected, he feels there's danger, and he snaps back, comes back to his physical body. The military person who was his contact there says, no, this is very dangerous. We have to stop this operation because those people can trace you back. So they shut the whole operation and send him back. Now, all this is to tell you that when a person is sufficiently conscious in the subtle physical, and you have this capacity, let's say, to shift like this, you can sense, because your subtle physical is organized, you can sense another subtle physical being who's there. You can interact with them. Of course, if you choose to be aware on that level, you could be completely closed and be physical only and open to those levels only in dream state. But if you are conscious enough, reasonably evolved, and it doesn't require spiritual evolution, it's purely a physical evolution, physical vital. You can sense somebody else, you can interact, you can perceive. And that's what happened when he went to the moon. And this shows you some of these ET species at least are at least as evolved, often seem to be far more evolved. Many of them are telepathic and even able to influence you telepathically. And so that tells you something interesting. You can project yourself certainly, but also you can interact in this way. So Chiara asks, do abduction or contactee experiences take place in physical dimension or subtle physical? Both are possible. It depends on the beings also and their purpose. So there are people who find themselves as if pulled out of the body or from their bed in the middle of the night, and they find themselves transported, floating out through the window going to a craft, and then they are coming back. If you saw only their physical body, you would say the fellow was here all the time. It is often a separation in the subtle physical and a projection, which is initiated from the other side for whatever purpose. There can equally be physical abductions, but then you can't be floated up and taken out through the window like that. Then it would be a physical experience. Of course, you can float physically, but that would be a completely different experience. Both are possible and both have happened. I don't know which is more common. It depends perhaps on the species and their interest in observing the human beings. There are. So Chiara asks about Michael Salla speaks of secret space program, which is a black project program in the United States, which allows travel between Earth and Mars, etc. There are such stories. So far, we don't have sufficiently compelling evidence to confirm that such a thing actually operates directly from Earth to Mars. So the description is that they create a portal like what I described earlier. You walk through and you're on Mars, and from the other end you walk through and you're on Earth. Maybe it's certainly possible, potentially. Whether they have it, I don't know. Maybe they do. But in future, certainly such things might be possible. And the means for it, of course, would involve very complex technologies which would be capable of such materialization and dematerialization. But right now, I just say, yes, it's possible, but we don't really know if they're actually doing it. Vachaspati asks, can we meet Sri Aurobindo in the subtle physical? What does the promise actually mean? And when Sri Aurobindo has promised that everything of him would remain in the physical realm. Yes, he promised that he will stay in the subtle physical until this work of physical transformation is over. And the mother continues also there. And that is why I spoke of the subtle physical ashram. I know of a case, for example, a lady in the ashram who was very distraught when there was an accident and someone known to her fell from a bus and died. So that afternoon she goes for a nap and she's thinking about him. She feels so bad. And it's a short afternoon nap. She finds herself pulled out of her body, taken by hand by the mother into a huge room. She finds on the other end Sri Aurobindo sitting on a chair and that person who died sitting at his feet. And mother takes her there and says, see, he's well. And he smiles and says, I'm well. She has this full darshan and she comes back. I think she wakes up in a few minutes. But she was given this subtle physical direct experience. I had another friend, Suresh Indocha, who, while he was living in Pondicherry, had shared many interesting experiences. One of these was that he met the mother in dream state. And it was tangible physically. So it was obviously in the subtle physical. But he said it was something strange. He saw the mother in all blue. The whole thing was bluish tint, as if the light is bluish. And he has this very vivid contact with her, wakes up. Next morning, he goes to the mother. Those days he was going. And he says, Mother, I saw you like this. And it was in all blue. And mother said, yes, that was in the subtle physical. That has this bluish tint. And she said, you will only find me in the subtle physical, not in other planes, because this is my domain of operation. Interesting. Yes, you can meet them. So I had lots of questions, but yes. So Chiara mentions Rudolf Steiner says that the planets that appear barren do have life teeming in the subtle physical in our solar system. Yes, it's true. In fact, on Mars, on Venus, there's a lot of life. Quite a bit of it in the subtle physical. They also have physical life forms. And at least on Mars, the physical life forms are under the Earth, that is in cave structures. And in Venus, I've already spoken about this in one of the earlier discussions. You see, they speak of very hot temperatures. Yes, it's true. But also Venus has permanent ice in the poles, which is also true, according to NASA. So in between, there has to be a band where your temperature is just right for human body, isn't it? Permanently. Maybe it oscillates a little bit at the top of mountains and so on. And yes, so there are beings also who live there, but it seems to be that the bulk of the civilization is in the subtle physical there. And it can be quite a rich life, very complex, enormous cities with all kinds of technological basis. Aditya asks, physical things when they dematerialize, where does the physical substance go? So when I read some of these descriptions of dematerializations, there's something very interesting I noted almost every time where this is described. So an example I read of, which was a Aikido master, I think, or one of these martial arts in Japan. He was one of those very rare masters. He had a capacity to simultaneously appear in two places. And so he demonstrated it, and the person who saw it records this, and that's the text I read. So the man was standing at the top of the stairs, and at the bottom of the stairs, these students were there. And he simultaneously appeared at the bottom of the stairs, full physical body, and then disappeared and reappeared and disappeared and appeared several times. And that was it. He demonstrated, and then they said, do it again. He said, no, the enormous effort that I have to put in, it drains out several years of my lifespan. Now, obviously that because of the method used and so on, but in principle, yes, you could do that. And it was the subtle physical that was projected and densified enough to be visible, but he couldn't hold the density. It kept slipping back. So he kept pushing, it slipped back, pushed, slipped back, and therefore the appearance, disappearance. And so, yes, that sort of thing is possible. The physical substance then, if it was a subtle physical materialization, it vanishes, appears, there's no physical substance there. But if you were to take a physical object and dematerialize, then this is the point I was coming to. In all those descriptions, and this was one of the things relating to the master, they experience as if a brief wind, a gust of wind. So if you think about it now, come back to that original Sri Aurobindo's line, for long before Earth's solid vest was forged by the technique of the atomic void. And this is now your physical science telling you, the whirl of energy, let's say electron whirling around the atom, creating as if a bubble. Two atoms join by sharing an electron. But what's inside them? In the atomic space itself is pure empty void. The nucleus of the atom is so tiny that if your nucleus was made the size of your fist, the electron would be a kilometer away. Because that's the kind of ratio that they speak of. All that space in between, forming a bubble around, which is the atom, is empty space. Now think about what that means. You take an object, a piece of dense heavy matter. I'm thinking of what would be a good piece, but well, just let's take my mobile phone here. So here's a heavy metallic object. Actually, this is 99.99999% empty space, held together by the whirl of energy, by the, let's say, mental construct will that holds the world together. If you dissolve that, the energy which is in world simply fizzles out. How much energy? It's, remember, 0.0000001% of actual substance. All you will have will be the gust of substance, poof, dissolving. Equally the reverse. If you materialize, it would gather energy of a physical density and slip into the grooves held by the object which is being materialized, and it would slip in and form the grooves and become material. So you're as if gathering, assembling material. That's the vocabulary used by those who materialize. You're assembling material which then slips into the groove created by the previous grade of matter. So ideally it starts with the mind forming a mental form, then pushed, densified into the vital energy, which amplifies, activates the form, and then giving it the fine shape which is close to the material as it comes down to the material level. And there it becomes tiny amount of matter assembled, which becomes your heavy physical glass and metal. That's all. And poof, as much it can dissolve or gather. So at the most dense level, you have supporting physical substance, which is dropped, dissolved, or gathered for this finer grade. This is typically how the thing happens. There's another grade which I discussed, how you shift vibration as if, in which case there's no material dissolving. You've taken the physical object, infuse it with a huge amount of life energy. This is where you get the key for dematerializing or pushing into the finer grade. When it is enormously vitally filled, it's literally as if the infused vital energy can begin to pull it up. And that's when the physical body suddenly becomes extremely light. Almost it feels as if it can float. And you can simply will it up and it will tend to float. Or you can tend to make it as if semi-transparent. This is another example that I've heard from people, again, very reliable, trustworthy. This was in a spiritual community which had some of these things happening. And this lady described how her first experience of meeting the teacher there, this was in the 40s or 50s. She's given a time, she goes into that room and she sees this master floating in a semi-transparent, resplendent, lit up body. Just like that, floating above the ground. And it was like literally a divine darshan. And then she comes away. And when she narrated it, she was in her 80s, and that was 60 years later. And she had tears in her eyes. And you could feel the vibration of that experience as it left such a deep imprint. But that's the kind of thing that is actually possible. But in this case, it was done by an occult means. Let's say a high divine being infused itself into the physical and raised it and so on. But the process would be similar. The infusion literally lifts the substance and raises it to a higher vibration, which literally slips it out of the physical or on the borderline. So yes, these things also do happen. And then once it would withdraw, the person would find himself back into the physical density of the physical body and so on. So I think that would be a comprehensive answer to the question of where the physical substance goes. Vaijayanti asks, do extraterrestrial beings, considering their superior technology and even spiritual sense, interfere in earthly matters? If situation demands, it depends. So there are extraterrestrial beings who are of a very coarse type. They're not more evolved than human beings, they just have technology. Some of them have been in the past coming to even steal people from the earth, like what you would find in, let's say, earlier medieval times, when you would have an army that comes and seizes a village and takes back with them the human beings as prisoners of war to become slaves for them. What you see the Romans doing to build their empire was to basically conquer territories and turn them into slaves, feeding the larger machinery of the empire. Yes, that sort of thing has also happened. And there's not much we can do technologically to protect from them. But equally, there are extraterrestrial beings who are of a diviner grade of evolution. And they are naturally, they live by higher values. One of the highest principles is not to interfere with the evolution of another or their free will. So only if something happens which is of a severe danger, that the evolution itself might be compromised, that they may intervene. So for example, if there was a nuclear war beginning, which would destroy the earth, they might intervene using their technology to prevent it. Which, as some of you would know, and I've mentioned this before, they have also done. Where sometimes it happens simultaneously in Russia and the United States. This flying saucer comes on a US base. All the lights go off instantly. And this is one of the bases where they have these missile silos and some of the most dangerous missiles. And the missiles have a battery backup and a generator backup. Those backups fail. And the flying saucer stays there long enough to prove to the humans that you can do nothing if we decide. And then it goes away. The lights come back. The missiles are not working. They open the missiles and find the computer chips inside completely fused. So first they thought it's a Russian attack. So they go on the hotline. The Russians are on the hotline saying, we had a UFO coming and doing this to us. Were you the ones? So both sides were as if warned, look, you can't mess around and we can stop you. Yes, they have interfered to that extent, to protect, to help. And if ever there was a very great danger, perhaps they would intervene, but normally not. And if you observe, like a scientist who is observing a new evolving species, you say, yes, let's see how it works. And we allow them to make mistakes because that's their only way to learn. But as I said, there are all gradations even of extraterrestrials. So I think that'll be enough for as far as these questions are concerned. There was further question from Trinetra about whether we could go into the subtle physical worlds and colonize them. It misses the whole point of evolution. So I'll come now to the closure of our discussion. Remember, our goal is not to go into a subtle physical domain and live there. Our goal was to enter the material physical domain in order to bring the spiritual potential here into matter. That's why we incarnated in the physical world. Otherwise, we could have stayed on any of these intermediate worlds and lived there, as so many beings do, and billions upon billions, isn't it? And such wonderful worlds, heavenly regions also, as well as hellish. But we chose to incarnate in the physical world because in the whole scheme of the cosmos, the physical is where all the potentialities of all the worlds are concentrated. And that potential bound in inconscience emerging is what we call evolution. And we came to participate in this evolutionary journey. And even if the earlier phase of our evolution was long, was painful, involved suffering, it's this point of awakening where we are now, which is the whole point of it. So to leave it halfway and go to some other plane is to lose this opportunity. We did not come here for that. We came here to fulfill. And I want to read from a couple of texts from the mother in regard to this. And this will be the closure of our discussion for today. See, she explains how this body, she says, and Sri Aurobindo, she is quoting Sri Aurobindo, this body is only an instrument and a shadow. So Mother said, this is the body as it is, inadequate. Okay? So it is only the instrument of the self, a very inadequate expression of this self, and a shadow. A shadow, something vague and obscure in comparison with the life and precision of the eternal self, which is what we are, by the way. So we have come from there to this shadow. Each time that the soul takes birth in a new body, it comes with the intention of having a new experience that will help it to develop and to perfect its personality. This is how the psychic being is formed from life to life and becomes completely conscious and independent personality, which once it has arrived at the summit of its development is free to choose not only the time of the incarnation, but the place, the purpose, the work to be accomplished. And so she says the descent into the body is a descent into darkness, yes, but if we cultivate the body by a clear-sighted and rational method, we are helping the growth of the soul, its progress and enlightenment. Now comes the key. Physical culture is the process of infusing consciousness into the cells of the body. One may or may not know it, but it is a fact. When we concentrate to make our muscles move according to our will, to make our limbs supple, to give agility or force or plasticity, we infuse into the cells of the body a consciousness which was not there before, thus turning it into an increasingly receptive instrument which progresses by its activities. This is the primary importance of physical culture. And she said, not people don't practice it for that reason, but this is what's happening behind. And she says it's a huge difference. If you work hard and your muscles grow strong, different from if you consciously exercise and make your muscles become conscious and strong. And she says those who work hard and have strength, there's always some imbalance. Whereas here there is a harmony. I'm summarizing. So, and then she says, as it is, the physical body is nothing but a very disfigured shadow of the eternal life of the self. But this physical body is capable of a progressive development. And one day it will be capable of building a bridge between the physical life as we know it and the supramental life which is to manifest. It's for this purpose that we have the physical training. Having done this, there's another text which I will only paraphrase, where Mother describes how she experienced in the body simultaneously multiple states of consciousness. And she says, if this is what is the future of the body, then it is going to be the most extraordinary instrument ever created by the divine. Because in a single substance, you can hold multiple states simultaneously, and the richness of that experience is unparalleled and impossible on all other planes of consciousness. And all this is just to point out the very special feature of the subtle body, of the physical body, that there is nothing, no other substance, no other plane where you can have that experience of what this body is capable of when it is, or as it approaches divinization. This being said, the process itself of deepening your consciousness and then bringing that deeper possibility into the physical and organizing it, that requires effort, that requires work. So I will read this. In a sense, it will be a completion of what we discussed last time. So it will close that whole discussion. Remember last time I said there was a passage I could not find. It goes like this. This knowledge of the inner states, she says, is not developed. There are huge gaps within us. So when people enter there for the first time, the inner states, they are bewildered. They have the impression they have fallen into the night, into nothingness, into non-being. I had a Danish friend, a painter, who was like that. He wanted me to teach him how to go out of the body. He used to have interesting dreams and thought it would be worth the trouble to go there consciously. So I made him go out, but it was a frightful thing. When he was dreaming, a part of his mind still remained conscious and active. A link existed between the active part and the external being. But to go out of the body means to pass gradually through it all the states of being, if one does the thing systematically. Well, already in the subtle physical, one is almost de-individualized. And when one goes farther, there remains nothing, for nothing is formed or individualized. Thus, when people are asked to meditate or told to go within, they enter into themselves. They are in agony, naturally. They have the impression that they are vanishing. And with reason, there is nothing, no consciousness. These things that appear to us quite natural and evident are, for most people who know nothing, wild imagination. If, for example, you transplant these experiences or this knowledge to the West, unless you have been frequenting the circle of occultists, they stare at you with open eyes. And when you have turned your back, they hasten to say, these people are cranks. So this I wanted to read out because it tells you how unconscious and undeveloped our inner potential is, which we are meant to awaken first and then infuse into the physical body. Therefore, take time. Make a conscious effort to open to the inner or higher presence. At first it is vague, at first it is unformed, it is indistinct, but experience the contact, the presence, deepen and hold and stay in that depth or height. Allow it to become organized. And this is how bit by bit these layers form, and then in the return you infuse what you have received into the physical body. The result is what the normal evolution of the body would take centuries to accomplish, you have attained in minutes from that infusion. It's not much, because actually those centuries give very little. But in a few minutes, what you have infused can be as much or more. And when you do this every day, there's a point where the substance itself begins to wake up and you experience the difference. Your body becomes so conscious, even as if you can feel, the body knows, the body says, and you can feel directly. And it is in this way that you're accelerating the consciousness of the tissue itself to its divine potential. And to the extent that you have grown in consciousness, you're able to infuse and thus accelerate. This is the work as far as the physical transformation is concerned. Even if you start with your mind, infusing your mental awareness into the body, literally feel your hands, make them grow aware and intensify the awareness. That's a mentalization of the physical consciousness. If you have ever learned to play instruments of music, you've already done this unconsciously in a tiny part of your fingers. Now do it for the whole hand. Bit by bit, do it for your whole body, starting with the parts which are more conscious, more receptive. And if in your deeper states you open to inner and higher influences, let those fill in and infuse into the body. There was also this question last time about how to create the place for the psychic being. And although we discussed it, I wanted to complete that with this idea. Everything you do in your life refer to this center of aspiration within you. That's how you will create the central organization of your personality. Otherwise, your mental will, primarily driven by desires, is your center, the axis around which all your life revolves. I want, I need, I can't. So that's the fear, negation of the desire, but I want or I fear. And the mind with logic centered around this desire center. That's your current center. And your physical body, therefore, is also organized around this. Your entire personality is organized around this. But this itself is a fluctuating, unstable center. So make it consciously the center of your deeper or higher aspiration. Even if through the mind, your mind's higher aspiration, if through the deeper heart's love for the divine, intimacy felt with the Divine Mother, that center closer to the psychic felt through the heart, either of these or both of these become your axis around which you organize everything you do in the day. No exception. Doesn't mean you have to do it instantaneously at that moment. You can do it later at the end of the day or in the beginning of the day. And we took last time some exercises. Start your day with thinking of all that you will do and hold it in reference to your aspiration and the divine presence within you. Let all these activities be a consecration to the divine and a nourishment for the soul's evolution and a fulfillment of my highest spiritual aspiration as far as possible. Start with that intention. End the day again with the whole thing. Everything that you did today, put it in relation to your central aspiration and your relationship with the divine and the purpose for which you were born. Look at it in terms of that. And naturally, bit by bit, spontaneously, effortlessly, some things will fade away, some things will grow stronger, and everything will be infused by the touch of these values and this aspiration. And then you will turn it all the way into the physical, this substance also. So at first what is received is in the subtle physical substance because it's the most plastic, most conscious, most receptive. But from there it is infused into the physical. And treat this body then as your most precious vehicle, your most precious instrument. Because if you don't have this, you're kicked out of the physical world, you don't have the potential for the physical evolution. And on other planes, you can't really evolve physically. But when you work on this consciousness and this body instrument, this is going to be the key to that future potential for which the whole universe has been struggling through billions of years. And you are right now its cutting edge of the spiritual potential in the physical body. Think about what that means. The entire universe leans towards you and says, I'm waiting for my hope here. And you're busy saying, what can I do? I'm bored. When you say, here's the most interesting thing to be done. Okay, you can't be doing that 24 hours, but at least a few minutes, a few seconds in a day, become conscious of this, infuse this intention, turn your whole being, your instrument, including the body, to the divine and say, here, this is the instrument, fill me with your love, your knowledge, your light, your strength. And you open and receive as a container. And if you do before sleeping, you go to sleep with that. When you wake up, you open an aspiration with that and then start your day. Don't worry if you forget. Hold the beginning and the end as your references. I think with this, we will close for today. I would like for all of you to take a look at the poll that we have put, whether we should continue further with questions regarding occultism and occult science. If you feel it is worth it, we will continue. Otherwise, we will switch topics. Keep this as your conscious intention now. Start with this morning if you are in a morning space. Start with this evening if you're in the evening space with this intention. Let's concentrate on this purpose all together. Namaste. Thank you all.
Namaste. Thank you.